A cold January sky hung over Maple Street as 6 unmarked police vehicles rolled into position and engines settled into a tense silence. Tactical officers stepped out in practiced sequence, boots on frozen pavement, eyes on a modest 2-story home that had blended into the neighborhood for decades. Inside, 78-year-old David Kowalski stood by his kitchen counter with steam rising from a chipped mug, the same morning ritual repeated for nearly half a century. At exactly 7:32 a.m., a sharp knock split the winter stillness, and a voice at the door named the charge, and pulled a buried year into the present. The 1971 murder of Catherine Fitzgerald. A hand trembled as the mug returned to the saucer. His face held steady. It looked as if he had rehearsed this moment in private and was ready to meet it now. A pillar of the community, a lifetime of committees, ceremonies, and smiling photographs. A second coffee cup long vanished. A dorm room locked from the inside. A town that thought it knew its own reflection. The mask had lasted almost 50 years. The door was finally opening. Who was the trusted figure who crossed a campus threshold without force and left behind almost nothing but silence and a timeline? How did a respected educator live among grieving parents, attend memorials, and read anniversary stories while carrying the one truth that could break them all open? If you want to uncover these answers, like this video now and subscribe to Unscripted Tales, and turn on the bell icon for the upcoming episodes. Tell me which city you are watching this cold case story from, and let us complete 5,000 likes on this chapter to push the investigation forward. The dawn raid unfolded with measured precision. 1 cruiser at the curb, another angled near the driveway, 4 more fanned out past trimmed hedges and sleeping mailboxes. Tactical officers moved to the front walk and around the side yard, a quiet ring closing over a house that had hosted barbecues, holiday lights, and decades of ordinary noise. Curtain edges shifted across the street as neighbors tried to make sense of vehicles without markings and men without expression. Inside the kitchen, the clock ticked toward the moment on the affidavit. The knock sounded again. A name was spoken. A clear directive followed, and the words "warrant for your arrest in connection with the 1971 homicide" filled the hallway like a winter draft. The man at the threshold did not argue. The man at the threshold did not plead. His fingers showed the briefest tremor, then stilled against the doorframe. The mug sat cooling on the counter behind him, the same way 2 cups once cooled beside open textbooks and a scarf that would never be worn again. He turned, called to his wife with a simple instruction to contact counsel, and faced the officers waiting to escort him outside. There was no struggle, only the slow surrender of a life that had been built in public while a single night remained hidden in private. As he stepped from the porch into the pale January light, the old questions woke up in the neighborhood air. No forced entry, a locked door, a narrow window of time, a second cup that should not have been there at all. Faces appeared in glass and then disappeared, the way they had on the morning news in years past, when anniversaries returned to ask for leads that never came. The convoy eased away from Maple Street, tires whispering on frost, and the ordinary house settled back into itself as if it had exhaled at last. Behind the departing vehicles remained a trail of unsettled memory that stretched to a campus in Cabell County, to a dormitory corridor that smelled of books and coffee, and to a room where a brilliant young woman had left notes half-written and a life paused on the edge of promise. For almost 50 years the investigation had been a map of missing lines. Today one line finally drew itself between past and present. The arrest did not answer everything. It did something more important. It told the truth that there was always someone who knew exactly how that door had closed. Morning light was thin over the Marshall University satellite campus in Cabell County. Red brick buildings sat close to the Appalachian foothills. Halls were quiet. Steps echoed. Doors clicked shut. It was the kind of calm that makes small sounds feel loud. In Sycamore Hall, a narrow corridor carried the smell of paper and coffee. Room numbers passed by in steady order, until the hallway stopped at a door that would not answer. Patricia Wilson stood there first with mild worry that sharpened into fear. Catherine had never missed their Tuesday breakfast. She had never missed class without a word. Patricia knocked once, then again harder. She called out and listened to the silence press back. Routine slipped away. She went for help with her hands shaking. Campus security arrived fast and moved with measured care. A master key turned. The door opened to a room that looked almost normal. A bed made tight, a desk stacked with notes and textbooks, a small cup of coffee still holding a line of warmth, and then the sight that ended the morning and set an entire county trembling. Catherine lay on the floor between the bed and the desk. The scarf that once warmed her neck had become the instrument that took her breath. The scene held an awful order. No drawers pulled out. No lamp smashed. No sign of a fight that tore the room apart. Just the smallest marks on her forearms. The suggestion of brief resistance against a force that came from behind and did not let go. Officers stepped back to protect every surface. They noted the position of the body. The open pages with half-written lines. The cooling cup. The second cup that should not have been there. The door had been locked. The window was closed. Nothing looked broken. Everything looked deliberate. It felt like someone she knew had been welcomed inside and had sat for coffee and conversation before the violence began. Word spread down the corridor and out across the campus. Students gathered in hushed groups. Phones rang in offices and homes. The town of Milton began to fold in on itself with fear and disbelief. A trusted place had become a crime scene. A promising life had stopped, with almost no trace of the person who did it. The question began that would stretch across decades and would not let the community sleep. Someone crossed that threshold without force and walked away. Without being seen, Catherine Fitzgerald entered the world on June 12, 1948, in Charleston, West Virginia. She was the eldest of three, the steady anchor of a close family that measured life in small acts of care. Her father worked long days as a civil engineer for the State Highway Department. Her mother taught piano lessons from their modest home on Kanawha Boulevard. The house held the sound of scales, the rustle of homework pages, and the gentle rhythm of a family that believed in effort and in hope. From the start, Catherine moved with quiet purpose. Teachers noticed first, then classmates. She listened hard. She asked careful questions. She solved problems and stayed late to help others do the same. By senior year, she stood at the top of her class as valedictorian. Her goal was medicine, not as a dream scribbled in the margin, but as a clear path she had drawn step by step, and guarded with discipline. College confirmed everything people had seen in her. She began at Marshall's main campus and then transferred to the smaller satellite campus in Cabell County for focus and tighter mentorship. Fewer buildings, shorter walks, more time with professors who knew her work by heart. The choice suited her. It gave her quiet, and it gave her speed. Life on campus looked simple from the outside and exact from the inside. She worked part-time in the library, where she shelved journals and guided students to the right shelves. She attended meetings of the Pre-Medical Society. She volunteered at Cabell County Hospital once a week and never missed a shift. When her roommate withdrew mid-semester, Catherine kept the private room and used the extra space for flashcards, lab notes, and a small kettle that sang in the late hours. Her diary told the rest. Tidy lists, due dates boxed in pencil, reminders to review enzyme pathways and organics, notes about calling home on Monday nights, plans for a summer internship, and a birthday card for her father. On March 15th, she wrote a final entry before midnight, a line of calm resolve after a long day of classes and library work. Tired but on track. One more problem set, one more review. This is the promise that paused in Sycamore Hall. A brilliant eldest daughter with a private room, a neat desk, and a schedule built to carry her into medicine. And somewhere between midnight and morning, A visitor who should have been a friend sat down to share a late cup of coffee and left behind the question that will not stop asking. Who was trusted enough to be welcomed inside at that hour of the day, moved in steady steps for Catherine. Afternoon classes first, comparative notes tucked into a binder, a quiet seat near the front. Dinner followed in the dining hall where she ate alone and studied between bites. Pages turned. A pen tapped. Routine held its shape at 7:15 p.m. She checked out 2 library books and walked back through the cool air towards Sycamore Hall. The building lights glowed against the hillside. The corridor smelled faintly of detergent and coffee. A neighbor saw her pass with her books pressed to her chest and her mind already on the next set of problems to solve. At 9:20 p.m., the phone call home went through, as it always did on a Monday night. Voices carried comfort across the line. Plans were mentioned, a father's birthday card to remember, an internship deadline to meet. Then the call ended, and the room grew quiet again except for the small sounds of a student at work later. A neighbor heard a kettle begin to sing from behind the door of room 214, a soft whistle that rose and then settled. Not long after, muffled conversation reached the hallway. Calm voices, nothing sharp, nothing loud. Just the low tone of 2 people sitting close with coffee and notes on a desk, sometime between 11:30 p.m. and 2:30 a.m. That calm was broken. Medical findings would set that window tightly and leave no comfort in its borders. By morning the room told a story with very few words. 2 coffee cups on the desk, one belonging to Catherine, one without a name. The door had been locked from the inside, and the key would later be found in her pocket. The window was closed and showed no fresh mark or scrape. The room was orderly. The scene felt chosen and controlled. Those small facts became the anchors of everything that followed. A late-night visitor who did not force a lock. A shared drink that suggested trust. A door secured after a life was taken. A space that gave almost nothing away and yet spoke in careful hints to anyone patient enough to listen. Someone would soon read those hints like a map and decide which pieces to collect first and which questions to ask before the trail cooled. Again, Sheriff Thomas Hayward stepped into Sycamore Hall with a steady expression that told everyone to slow down and see clearly. Detective Frank Mullins followed him, a notepad already open, eyes tracing the doorway, the floor, the desk. Medical examiner Dr. Howard Levitt arrived with a small team and a metal case that clicked shut as he knelt beside Catherine. The room held its terrible order. Nothing loud. Nothing torn apart. Only details that spoke in quiet lines to those who knew how to listen. They noted the ligature marks first. A scarf pulled tight with deliberate pressure. Dr. Levitt moved with care as he checked for lividity and temperature, then pointed to the faint pattern on the skin that told how long and how hard the force had been applied. Mullins recorded the defensive bruising along Catherine's forearms, small crescents of broken fingernails on her right hand, the brief fight for breath that had left traces, even when the rest of the room hid the struggle. Every item took a place in the log. Fingerprints lifted from hard surfaces and carefully labeled. Fibers collected from the carpet near where she lay and sealed in envelopes. 2 coffee cups swabbed for prints and residue. Most precious of all, Dr. Levitt guided the collection of skin cells from beneath her fingernails. He spoke softly as the evidence text worked. Preserve this as if it will need to speak many years from now. Mullins circled the desk once more and drew an outline of positions. Books open, notes half written, a kettle on the shelf. The second cup that did not belong to her. Outside the dorm, the world changed in minutes. Campus officials pushed out emergency calls. Classes were cancelled for the week. Students gathered in clusters with hands wrapped around backpacks and faces pulled tight against the cold. The library closed early. The administration set up a hotline in the main office. In town, businesses dimmed signs and pastors opened church doors for prayer. Parents drove in from miles away and stood in lobby lines to bring daughters home. Radio stations broke into music with updates every hour. That morning turned a close community into a room where everyone spoke in whispers. Hayward and Mullins worked the corridor until evening, then again under brighter lamps. They left nothing rushed. They left nothing assumed. By nightfall, the evidence lockers held a careful map of a crime that offered very few words. It was enough to begin asking who could have sat at that desk, shared a quiet drink, and walked away leaving so little behind. Someone would now draw the first circles of suspicion and test each name against the locked door, the second cup, and the marks on a young woman's hands. Detective Frank Mullins spread a blank sheet on the conference table and drew 3 rings in slow strokes. In the center he wrote Catherine and set a pencil on the line as if to pin the moment in place. The first circle would hold the people woven into her daily life. The second would hold those who crossed paths with her in classes, at work, and on routine errands. The third would hold everyone else who might have brushed close and then drifted away. Start at the center. Test every name against the locked door, the 2 cups, and the quiet room that hid almost everything except intent. The first circle pointed to Thomas Mitchell. 8 months together. A breakup in January. Notes in her diary that he did not accept her plan to place medical school above marriage. Classic motive on paper. Mullins brought him in and listened. Study partners confirmed he was in Huntington that night. A dorm landline call at 11:30 p.m. placed him miles away inside the window that mattered most. The story held under pressure. Timelines aligned. No fibers, no marks. The inward ring loosened, and the ex-boyfriend stepped out of it with suspicion fading at his back. The second circle expanded down the residence hall and into the system that managed the building after hours. A student remembered a maintenance man in the corridor late that evening. The description fit Raymond Lewis, who had keys to every door and reason to be anywhere. Mullins felt the snap of a lead and followed it straight to Cabell County Hospital. Records showed Lewis had been admitted at 9:45 p.m. with a broken ankle and kept overnight. Nurses remembered his frustration and his pain. There was no way to walk Sycamore Hall on that leg. The circle closed again, and the promising lead went out like a match in wind. The third circle reached into the faculty offices. Advanced chemistry had a demanding instructor. Professor William Harris called Catherine in after class more than once for extended discussion. Several students noticed. One called it attention that felt too focused. Harris arrived at the station with his hands open and his schedule in order. His wife and teenage children confirmed that he had been at home for the evening. His prints did not match anything useful from the room. There were no fibers to connect him. There was only rumor and posture, and that was not enough to hold him in the ring. Mullins returned to rules and lists. Sycamore Hall required visitors to sign in and to leave by 10. The log showed no entry for Catherine that night. The night guard swore the desk never sat empty longer than a minute. The door to room 214 had been locked from the inside when it opened under the master key. The window was closed and unmarked. The second coffee cup was the stubborn fact. It said that someone sat down across from her without fear and without rush. It said that a conversation began and became something else. It said that a hand wiped a surface clean and that another hand fought back and caught skin visitor logs suggested a rule was followed. The locked door suggested a rule was broken. Mullins pressed these 2 ideas together and held them to the light. If no one signed in, then the person did not need to sign. A resident, a staff member with access, a person known well enough to be waved past a desk on a quiet night. The map of suspicion redrew itself along these lines, and the list of names changed with it. Each would be checked for scratches, for absences, for stories that slipped when repeated. The second cup stayed missing from the evidence table and felt like a voice that kept talking from somewhere just out of view. Days turned into weeks as interview sheets stacked high on Detective Mullins's desk. Dorm residents, classmates, professors, custodians, library staff, bus drivers on regular routes. Each person added a thread that seemed ready to tie back to room 214, and each thread refused to hold. Evidence bags filled a labeled row in the locker. Fingerprint lifts, fiber envelopes, photographs from every angle, chain of custody forms clipped tight. The map on the wall grew crowded with pins, and still there was no line that could be drawn from a name to that second cup. And to the scarf that had been pulled tight in June, an elderly neighbor named Margaret Simmons stepped forward with a memory that sharpened every ear in the room. From her window across the way, she had seen a figure climb out and drop to the ground near Sycamore Hall, about 1 in the morning. Average height, dark clothing, nothing more that could turn a shadow into a person. The time fit the medical window. The path seemed possible in night silence. Mullins sent officers to canvass again, and to measure the drop, and to check for any sign left on brick or soil. Nothing fresh appeared. No second witness could anchor the image. The description hung there like a shape in fog by September. The pressure of leads thinned to a slow drip. Sheriff Hayward stood with the Fitzgerald family and spoke carefully. The investigation would remain open. Officers would continue to review tips. The case would shift to inactive status so that new crimes could be handled on schedule. No one in that room mistook the words for surrender. Hayward made a promise, and Mullins wrote it again on the case summary. Every item will be preserved. Every record will be kept. Every box will be protected, as if one day the evidence itself will speak with a stronger voice. The files moved to storage shelves with extra space around them and a clear tag that warned against careless hands. The second coffee cup remained the absence that everyone could feel without touching. The door had been locked. The window had been closed. A figure had possibly slipped down a wall after midnight. The scene had offered almost nothing, and yet enough to insist that the right eyes would one day see the missing step. Some families turn toward the world when the official search goes quiet and decide to make their own light where the hallway has gone dark. The Fitzgerald home grew very quiet after the funeral. Plates arrived from neighbors and then went cold on the counter. The piano stayed closed. Even small tasks felt heavy. Elizabeth moved through rooms with careful steps and kept her hands busy to keep her mind from falling. Michael sat at the kitchen table most evenings and stared at the same chair as if he expected his eldest to walk in and ask for coffee. Margaret watched both of them and learned the hard way how absence can fill an entire house. Grief taught them new routines. Elizabeth set times for calls with detectives so that fear would not sneak up at night. Michael began to write. He bought a leather notebook, then another, then a shelf to hold them. He copied case numbers and dates. He listed names, phone calls, tips, and stray details overheard at the grocery store or at church. He built timelines and taped them to the inside covers with neat corners. He did not want memory to blur what time had already begun to smudge. Elizabeth chose a different road and stepped out to meet other families who carried the same weight. She gathered them in a living room at first and listened. The listening turned into a plan. West Virginia Families for Justice was born from those early meetings, from coffee poured at a dining table, and from the decision that sorrow would not be the last word. The group grew from a handful of chairs to crowded halls. They lobbied for stronger evidence preservation. They pushed for longer retention and better storage. They met with lawmakers and turned private grief into public policy that could hold for every family who might one day need it. Michael kept journaling through each season. He clipped articles and filed them by year. He recorded every anniversary story and every rumor that seemed worth the ink it would take to write it down. When the sheriff called with an update, however small, Michael dated the page and added a line. It was his way to keep Catherine in the present tense. It was his way to make sure that when science moved forward, their paper trail would be ready to meet it. Margaret was 16 when her sister was taken. She finished high school with a face older than her years and a focus that did not bend. College followed, law school after that. She chose the prosecutor's path and never forgot who she stood for when she rose in a courtroom. She could not touch her sister's case, but she carried Catherine into every argument for a victim and every request for fairness that would not wear out with time. In interviews, she spoke calmly about rights, about dignity, and about the patience it takes to reach justice when answers come slow. By the end of that first long year, the family had changed shape. They still set an extra place without thinking, and then took it away. They still paused at the front door expecting a familiar step. But they also carried new work into each day. A mother who built a circle of voices, a father who guarded the written record, a sister who chose the law and turned pain into purpose. The house remained quiet, but inside that quiet there was resolve, and it would last across decades. People in town began to say that the Fitzgeralds had given the state a new backbone when it came to caring for evidence and for the families left waiting. That backbone would hold steady when the story moved into courtrooms, classrooms, and the halls where policy changes begin. Years would pass and memory would fade for some, but the journals, the meetings, and the steady voice in court would keep Catherine's name from slipping out of sight. And those efforts would meet technology on a day that no one could predict, but everyone hoped would come. Every few years the story surged back like a tide. That 5 years, the local paper ran a week of features with old photos and new interviews. At 10 years, a television crew walked the campus with a slow camera and a careful voice that asked the same hard questions. At 20 years, students who had not been born in 1971 learned Catherine's name in classrooms and dorm meetings and carried candles across the quad on a cold night. At 25 years, the attention widened as talk of DNA reached living rooms and gave families a new word to hold. At 30 years, radio hosts invited detectives and advocates to explain what had been preserved and why that mattered. At 40 years, the tone shifted to worry and to weariness, and yet the coverage still ended with a glimmer that tomorrow could be different. Those waves did more than fill airtime. They changed habits. Evidence rooms across the county took on new rules. Boxes were logged with extra care, paper instead of plastic, for anything that might carry trace material, cooler storage when possible, clear chain of custody that left no space for doubt. Officers in training heard Catherine's name as a lesson about time and patience, and how a sample from a fingernail can become a voice when science finally learns how to listen. Campuses felt the ripple too. In the early 1970s, dorms across West Virginia added stronger visitor rules, better lighting, and round-the-clock staffing. Electronic keys replaced skeleton rings that once opened everything. Logs were guarded. Desks were never left alone. Staff were trained to look twice before a door clicked shut. Those changes were born of grief, but they became the standard that protected students who never knew why the rule existed in the first place. The landscape itself changed with the years. Sycamore Hall came down in 2001 under clear sky and careful machines. Students stood behind tape and watched bricks fall that had once held so many ordinary days and one night that never left. A new residential complex rose in its place with bright windows and safer hallways. A small plaque near a garden bench kept a name in the open air so that the ground would not forget what had rested there. As the town grew and new families moved in, the story shifted from living memory to local history. Some heard it first in a class. Some read it in the paper at an anniversary. Some learned it from an older neighbor who had stood by the street and watched unmarked vehicles glide past a winter lawn. Memory softened at the edges, but the reforms remained hard and useful and ready, and they were part of why future cases found answers faster than anyone once believed possible. Each new cycle of attention added one more layer to a community that was learning how to keep faith with its past while making room for its next generation, and that steady layering would matter when a detective opened a long box and decided to send what remained to a lab that could reach farther than anyone had ever reached before. The case boxes came out again in 1996, dust brushed off. Seals checked twice. Sheriff William Donovan signed a fresh review order and set a small team to work. Detective files were scanned and indexed. Photographs were reprinted with cleaner contrast. Most carefully of all, the remaining biological samples were repackaged and placed under refrigeration. Forensic technician Sandra Morris led that step with high, steady hands and a clear warning that time could be both an enemy and a partner if the samples were kept safe, enough to outlast the science of the moment. The evidence. Lockers felt different after that. Paper envelopes replaced old plastic. Labels were rewritten in bold ink. Chain of custody logs left no gaps. The skin cells saved from beneath Catherine's fingernails were moved into a temperature-controlled unit and logged with the care usually reserved for museum pieces. The message was simple. Protect this now so it can speak later in 1998. The room filled with a quiet kind of hope. Early DNA testing had reached local news. Families clipped articles and circled the word match as if it could cross decades by itself. The team agreed to try. The lab ran the best process available at the time and pushed hard against the limits of the material. Reports returned with language that did not comfort anyone. Partial, degraded, inconclusive. The effort consumed precious sample and gave only a faint outline back. It felt like standing at a door with the key half cut. No one quit. The files went back into careful order, and the routine of review became a rhythm. Every few years, detectives opened the binders, reread witness statements, and compared old timelines to newer analytic methods. Automated fingerprint searches were rerun as state and federal systems expanded. Fiber analysis was revisited with better microscopes. Statement analysis tools were applied to transcripts that had been typed on manual machines. Each pass found small things to correct, and nothing large enough to carry to a courtroom. As the 40th year approached, the tone across town shifted. Reporters still called, families still gathered, but people began to ask if justice might be out of reach. The word impossible crept into headlines and then was pushed back by advocates who reminded everyone that the evidence had been saved for a reason. The journals on Michael Fitzgerald's shelf did not slow. Elizabeth's group kept meeting and kept pressing for resources. The case remained a quiet fire that no one allowed to go out. Science was moving even when the file sat still. New databases were built. New markers were added. New methods hinted that a profile might one day be found, not by meeting a suspect head-on, but by finding the family around him. The turn would begin when a detective decided to send a small box to a lab that could read a map drawn in. Cousins and grandparents rather than in direct matches. Quiet shift began in laboratories long before anyone heard the good news on television. The National DNA System expanded its markers from 13 to 20. That upgrade meant profiles could speak more clearly and could stand up better against time. At the same moment, a new idea moved from theory to practice. If a direct match could not be found, investigators might still find a path through relatives who had never set foot in a police station. Familial searching turned a locked door into a door with light under it. Then genetic genealogy rose like a bridge between two shores. People mailed kits to learn where their ancestors had lived. Databases grew with voluntary entries. Analysts discovered that a small group of distant cousins could lead to a single name if you were patient and careful with records. When an infamous serial offender was identified through relatives in 2018, the message carried to every cold case unit in the country. It could be done. A case without a suspect could still find one through a family tree drawn backward, and then forward again. Detective Sarah Keller had taken custody of Catherine's file in 2015 and did not treat it like an archive. She scanned every page and tagged each entry so that a single search could pull old notes together in seconds. Witness statements became searchable text. Evidence inventories turned into clean spreadsheets. Photographs were rescued from fading prints and stored with clear labels. The entire case lived both on paper and inside a secure drive where it could be sorted by date, by name, and by type of clue. Keller read through the new science and watched what other agencies were doing. She saw where older samples had survived and where careful storage had saved the day. In late 2018, she wrote a request that was both modest and bold. Send what remains to a specialized lab. Try genetic genealogy. Accept the chance that the past had left enough for the present to use. The request moved through approval and budget checks and came back with a yes-a. Small package would soon leave the evidence room and cross state lines to a place where thousands of markers could be read and compared. And what came back might change a quiet file into a loud knock on a winter morning. Detective Sarah Keller signed for the evidence and placed a small box on clean white paper. The package looked ordinary. The weight felt like almost nothing. Inside were the preserved skin cells taken from beneath Catherine's fingernails, care that began in 1971 and continued through every review had protected what little remained. Labels were checked twice. Forms were sealed. Then the box began its quiet trip to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia. At the lab, scientists opened the box with the care of archivists and surgeons at the same time. The first reports came back with hard truths. The DNA was badly fragmented from age and storage limits in the early decades. There was very little to work with. The team used whole genome amplification to copy what survived, multiplying faint fragments until there was enough to read. Piece by piece, markers emerged. Hundreds of thousands of points became a sketch of a person who had fought a young woman in a dorm room and walked away. The profile did not find a direct match in criminal databases. It did something else. It found distant relatives who had shared their genetic information through voluntary services. 17 people with ties that reached to great-great-grandparents. The lab began to build family trees, old marriage records, birth certificates, obituaries, census pages, lines that started with a single shared ancestor and branched forward across states and decades. The whiteboard filled with names and dates until it looked like a forest detective Keller watched. The lists narrow as filters were applied. Male, 18 to 40 in 1971, a real link to Cabell County during that school year. The forest thinned. 38 became 7. 7 men who could have been in that hallway. 7 men whose families fit the genetic map. 7 men who needed to be tested against the life that Catherine lived. On April 2nd, the shortlist landed in Keller's inbox. She recognized more than one name from the digitized case files. One name stopped her hand. David Kowalski, age 78. Huntington, West Virginia. Interviewed in 1971 as a routine contact. A high school chemistry teacher who sometimes tutored college students and guest lectured at the satellite campus. Not flagged as a suspect at the time. His statement from the old canvas said he had last seen Catherine 2 weeks before her death. The note sat almost alone in the file until the family tree placed his name under a branch that mattered. Keller needed confirmation without alerting him. A surveillance team waited and watched. The opportunity came at a coffee shop where a paper cup went into a bin and stayed long enough for an officer to retrieve it lawfully. The cup reached the lab within hours. Technicians swabbed the rim and returned a profile that could be compared to the amplified DNA from Catherine's fingernails. The result arrived with numbers that left no room for doubt. The DNA from the discarded cup matched the DNA recovered from beneath Catherine's fingernails at a probability so high that it read like certainty. The map, built from distant cousins and careful records, had led to a single door on Maple Street. The second cup that once sat on her desk had finally found its voice through a different cup left behind, almost 50 years later. Keller stared at the match report and felt the case change shape. The long, quiet lines of the file connected in a straight path to a name that had lived in the community for decades without suspicion. Plans for an arrest began to form in careful steps. A winter morning was chosen. Vehicles assigned. Scripts rehearsed. A team prepared to knock on a door that had never looked dangerous from the sidewalk a respected teacher, a trusted neighbor, a man who had attended memorials and offered steady smiles. The arrest would show 2 lives inside one person and would open a room in the past that had been locked for almost half a century. When the match report named David Kowalski, the portrait that emerged did not look like a fugitive hiding at the edge of town. It looked like the center of it. He had taught chemistry at the high school with steady patience. He completed a doctorate and moved to the university, where he mentored students, chaired a department, and shook hands at commencements. He served 3 terms on the city council. He coached youth soccer on fall Saturdays, where parents clapped along the sidelines. In 1997, the Rotary named him Citizen of the Year for service that seemed to confirm what everyone thought they knew about his character. He did not keep his distance from the loss that had scarred the community. He stepped toward it. He stood at Catherine's funeral with a solemn face and a folded program. He wrote small checks to the scholarship fund in her name, year after year, amounts that looked humble and felt sincere. He sat on a governor's task force beside Elizabeth Fitzgerald to discuss campus safety, offering measured comments about lighting and key control, while the truth sat silent behind his calm eyes. He attended memorials on major anniversaries and nodded along when speakers called for vigilance and compassion. Detectives later carried boxes from his basement and found a careful archive that he had kept hidden. Newspaper clippings preserved in sleeves, a neat stack arranged by date with penciled notes in the margins. The collection suggested a man who revisited the story regularly in private while presenting devotion to community in public. It was a life built like a stage set, bright at the front, reinforced by beams. The audience was never meant to see a forensic psychologist reviewed the pattern and spoke in even language that did not soften the conclusion. Sustained deception on this scale requires planning, rehearsal, and reward. He embedded himself inside the very circle his act had wounded, and each public gesture strengthened the mask. This was not merely hiding. This was replacement. He replaced suspicion with access. He replaced distance with service. He replaced the memory of a night with 1,000 small acts of visible goodness, until the mask felt real to almost everyone who looked at it. The idea that one person could hold both lives at once stunned a town that had trusted the public version for decades. And that shock would deepen when investigators began to reconstruct the hours in which trust inside a dorm room turned into violence and a carefully staged exit carried a man back into an ordinary marriage and a waiting bed. Detectives laid the timeline across the table and set each piece exactly where it belonged. Catherine had studied through the evening. A kettle had whistled. A calm voice was heard through the door. The visitor did not force a lock or rattle a handle. The most plausible path was simple and devastating. A trusted instructor arrived under the pretext of chemistry help. He had tutored before. He had guest lectured. He was a familiar face with answers to difficult problems. Catherine opened the door, set water to boil, and made room at the desk where her notes already waited. The talk began as work. Pages turned. A pen moved. A cup was set down beside another cup. And then something crossed a boundary, a look that asked for more than study, a request that did not belong in a dorm room. Catherine declined with the same firmness she used to guard her time and her goals. The shift happened quickly after that. The scarf that warmed her neck became a tool in another hand. Pressure from behind, a struggle measured in seconds rather than minutes. Defensive bruises on her arms and broken nails on her right hand marked the effort to push away what would not stop. The room read as careful after the violence. Surfaces were wiped in deliberate paths. The second cup was taken and carried away. The door that would later be opened by a master key had been locked from the inside and the key placed in Catherine's pocket. The exit relied on timing more than force. A brief change at the desk downstairs created a slim opening. A corridor held its breath while footsteps moved past and away. Outside, the walk home was short enough to fold into a single story, told to a silent conscience. At the house on Maple Street, a different silence held. A wife had taken sleep medication as part of a long-standing routine. She would later remember nothing about the hour that mattered. The man who lay down beside her had already begun the work of replacing a crime with the hundreds of small acts that build an entirely different life in public. When warrants finally opened his basement years later, the mask slipped in the neatest part of the house. Investigators found a chronological archive of clippings about Catherine's case, each in a sleeve, each dated, many with small pencil marks in the margins. Behind a false panel they found a small box. Inside rested a cup that did not match any set in the kitchen upstairs. It was wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked away, as if memory required an object to return to again and again. The picture that formed was not of a sudden storm, but of a plan held steady by patience and control, a plan that depended on trust to pass a threshold, and on cold focus to erase traces once the harm was done. And somewhere within that plan, a single error waited to be amplified by science, until a winter morning knock could no longer be ignored. The news broke across Cabell County before noon, and disbelief moved faster than the winter wind. Former students stared at photographs and tried to match a familiar smile with the headline. Neighbors stepped onto porches and spoke softly across hedges. The university issued a careful statement, and then a stronger one. Honors tied to his name were removed from plaques and programs. A scholarship that once carried his signature was dissolved, and a new fellowship rose in Catherine Fitzgerald's memory, with language that promised support for students who followed the path she had begun and never had the chance to finish. The campus changed tone overnight. A donor wall with polished brass lost a line of letters. A lecture hall door that had welcomed him for years was shut to his history. Faculty who had worked beside him gathered in a small room and sat without speaking for a long stretch. The reckoning did not come with shouting. It came with lists, with careful audits, with the quiet work of separating an institution from a persona it once trusted. At the courthouse, the first hearing drew a crowd that filled every bench and spilled into hallways. The assigned judge had been a student of his decades earlier and stepped aside without hesitation. A neutral bench was brought in from a neighboring county to keep the air clear of conflict. The defendant entered in orange with shoulders lower than anyone, remembered and answered the clerk with a formal plea that everyone recognized as procedure rather than strategy behind. The scene's prosecutors sent the amplified DNA out for an independent lab review, and received confirmation that matched the first report with overwhelming probability. Plea discussions began under strict terms. The science was no longer a single thread. It was a rope of findings strong enough to carry the weight of a half-century. The Fitzgerald family stood before cameras once, and only once during that week. Elizabeth listened to the questions and did not rush. Her voice was calm, the kind of calm that has been earned one day at a time over many years. She thanked the investigators who had preserved the samples and the advocates who had kept the case alive. She did not speak about anger. She spoke about completion. Margaret stepped to the microphone next and gave the public the precision of a seasoned prosecutor. She named the steps that had brought them to this point. She named the people who had done the work. She asked the community to be measured in its reaction, and to hold space for the students who had placed their trust in a man now accused of a hidden life outside. The television vans powered down, and the courthouse lawn emptied. A cold wind moved the flags. Somewhere a family photo album still held pages of award ceremonies and handshakes. Somewhere else, a shelf of journals in a quiet Charleston home stood as steady as ever, ready to hold one more date and one more line. The legal calendar turned toward a decision that would either open a full trial or pull years of argument into a single day of final judgment. And the choice would hinge on how a man who lived two lives decided to speak when the courtroom lights were fixed on him alone. On March 15th of 2019, the courtroom filled before sunrise. Faces from every chapter of this story found a place on the benches. Reporters adjusted cables. Former students sat with hands laced tight. The defendant stood and entered a plea of guilty to first-degree murder. The words landed with a weight that loosened shoulders across the room and brought quiet tears to eyes that had held back for years. 6 weeks later, on April 30th, the court convened for sentencing. The judge reviewed the record, the evidence, the family impact statements that had been written with care and read with dignity. When asked if he wished to speak, David Kowalski rose slowly and lifted his chin toward the bench. He offered a brief statement that acknowledged a life divided in two, the one he built for the world and the one that had begun in a dorm room on a March night. There was no excuse. There was only an admission that came far too late for the person it should have protected. The sentence was life, without the possibility of parole. At 78 years of age, it meant the remainder of his days would be measured by a gate and a number. He turned once as deputies guided him away. For a moment the room held the strange silence of an ending that is both final and insufficient. Nothing returns a lost life. Justice only marks the place where harm stops moving forward. What followed reached far beyond a single case. The investigation became a national teaching model for genetic genealogy. Agencies across the country studied the steps that preserved a fragile sample for nearly 5 decades and learned how a family tree can become a map that points to a single name. Universities and departments used the case to strengthen how evidence is handled. The local campus opened an ethics center devoted to professional responsibility and moral courage. At the site where Sycamore Hall once stood a small memorial garden welcomed students to sit for a moment, with the lesson that safety is built every day by choices seen and unseen. The Fitzgerald family returned, home with a kind of relief that does not shout. Michael's journals remained on their shelf. Margaret spoke to young prosecutors about patience and precision and the long arc that good work can travel. Elizabeth rested easier. 1 year after the sentencing, she passed away in her sleep with her daughter's name at peace in the public record. She had witnessed the truth spoken aloud in a court of law. The promise she had asked of the county had been kept. This story closes with a lesson that moves forward. Cold cases are not frozen by fate. They wait for careful hands and better tools, and the stubborn love of families who refuse to forget. Science will keep opening doors that once looked sealed. Files that sit quietly today can still find a voice tomorrow. And here at Unscripted Tales, we will keep walking into those rooms with you and turning on the light. If you are still watching this story, it means it earned your like. Please subscribe to Unscripted Tales and turn on the bell icon so you never miss when justice finally speaks. Help me reach 5,000 likes on this story, because that is the target my mother set for you. And it is completely free. Tell me from which city you are watching. I am reading every comment, and I want to hear your voice beside Catherine's name.